Everyone, welcome to another video. This video we're going over how to paint Saim Hann Eldar. What we're going to do is this video is going to be split in two. The first video, which is what we're going to be going over now, is going to be going over how to paint a jet bike with no airbrush as always, and the second part of the video will be going over how we paint the rider. So as always, I hope it's helpful. If you've got any questions, queries, leave them in the comments below. As always, if you are enjoying the video, if you do find it helpful, make sure you hit the like button, and if you want to see more, that subscribe button. But here we go. So first thing that we do, the bike is primed with a grey primer. Grey or white works best for this, I find, because what will happen is the brighter your primer, the more vibrant your red is going to be. The red that I'm using is P3 Khador Red Base. It covers really well. It's also got a really nice vibrant colour to it. So it just works for me. I don't find it's overly orange. It's just a really strong saturated red, and I really like it. So preferably what you want here with this stage is you want to have a bright prime color. So whatever you've primed your color in, you want it to be relatively bright. If you actually use the red over a yellow or a pink, that works really nice as well to make it nice and vibrant, but gray or white works as well. You can see that I'm using a really big brush here. This is just a cheap makeup brush from like Poundland or something like that. So really, it's literally like £1 for a brush. They're really quite rubbish, but it does the job. The paint consistency for this, all I've done is add in enough water to break the surface tension of the paint. So basically add water to the paint until you get to a point where it's no longer sticky and it flows quite easily. But I've only thinned it just about enough. I don't want to thin it too much because ideally I want to do this in less than like 1 or maybe 2 coats at a push. This is supposed to be an army project, so I want to speed. I want to make as much progress as possible, as quickly as possible. So we're just going over the whole model with this. Now I would recommend that you paint the riders separately on these models, but I haven't done in this case because I wasn't too bothered about the detail underneath the rider, because obviously this is just for YouTube. But I would highly recommend that you paint the riders separately. You can see that I've got the head separate as well because I'm going to be painting white. And if you're painting something white, it's nearly always better to have that part on the model separate. You can see I'm not really being too careful about this. The main thing that I'm making sure that I do is that I'm not leaving any big blobs of paint. Now, a huge part of that actually comes down to the consistency of your paint. If you're leaving really thick, streaky marks of paint, then your paint is too thick. If your paint's not covering very well and it's looking really watery, then it's obviously too thin. Now, as always, too thin is better than too thick. If the paint's too thin, it just means that you're going to have to do multiple coats and it's going to slow you down. So if you're concerned, just thin your paint a little bit more. It's better to have to do multiple coats rather than having big thick blobs of streaky paint on the model. That's what you want to avoid at all costs. Now, you can see this red that we get from this P3 Khador Red Base is actually really nice. It's really vibrant. Now, red is a really big challenge, and the problem with red is it's very easy to make it go pink, orange, or like a yellow color. We want to avoid that at all costs. It's also very easy to make red look very dirty if you start adding black to it. So you need to be really careful about the colors that you use. Now, if we want to keep a nice saturated red, then the only real place to go from here, we can still highlight it, which is fine. We can still highlight that red, but we need to keep those highlights really small. So biggest strength that we have when it comes to red is actually shadow, is making our shadows as dark as possible. So what I've grabbed here is this is Games Workshop Khorne Red Base. Now what you're going to see is, although this gives us a darker version of this red, it's not actually very dark. So the jump between the P3 Khador Red Base and the Games Workshop Khorne Red is not actually very much, so it doesn't stand out very much. Now, you could effectively skip this stage if you wanted to, but I wanted to show it off because I know a lot of people are not necessarily big fans of the extreme value contrast style of painting. So you could just use Khorne Red and it would give you a nice shadow color, but it would be much flatter. So it's entirely up to you. But you can see, like, I'm not worried about blending or anything like that at this stage. What I'm concerned about is where I'm going to place my shadow colors to make sure that my red pops as much as possible and still stays that saturated red. Because remember, the color of the jet bike, the Saim Hann colors, come from Khador Red Base. So the majority of the jet bike needs to stay at Khador Red Base, because that's what is giving us that really saturated red. So the majority of the model needs to stay the P3 red. This is really, really important. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with like a really, really dark red jet bike that's not going to look Saim Hann. Or if your highlights are too large, you're going to end up with a pink looking jet bike, and that's what we want to avoid at all costs. So we can blend it later, and ultimately we're going to need to fix blends later anyway, because when you're painting something this big with a paintbrush, there's always going to be parts of the paintwork that you need to fix. You may as well just do it all in one go later on. Now, this is one way. On the canopy itself, the canopy is, because it's such a large area, it can be really difficult to smooth out the darker area and the brighter area, because you've only got a brush that's so big, or rather the brushes that we use generally are only so big. Generally, most people only have like up to a size 2. So in this case, I'm going back to my makeup brushes that I was using. And what I'm doing is so this is not a dry brush, right? So I'm putting paint on the model. The paint is thinned down enough, same as the base coat, so just enough to break the surface tension. So we're not going to get any big, thick blobs of paint that stay in the same place. You want that paint to flow. And then what we're doing is we're removing the excess paint from the makeup brush. So basically we don't have huge amounts of paint on the brush. It's still got paint there, but it's not going to leave massive chunks of it. So just run the brush over a bit of kitchen roll or something like that, remove the excess. And then all you're doing is you're working from one shade to the other. So for example, if you have the P3 Khador Red Base on your paintbrush, you would work from Khorne Red on the model. Your brush stroke would start on the Khorne Red on the model, and it would end in the P3 Khador Red Base. Same as if you had the Khorne Red on your paintbrush, you would work from the P3 Red on the model, and you would work it into the Khorne Red. So the idea is your brush direction, your brush stroke direction, is always going towards the paint that's on your brush. So if you've got one color on your brush and one color on the model, going towards the same color. Basically, because what happens is at the end of every brush stroke, it leaves lots of little marks. Now, as long as your paint is fairly wet, as long as it's not really like thick, what will happen is it will just start smudging those colors together. And if you want a more in-depth explanation on how this works, what you want to do is check out how I painted the red armor on the Brass Scorpion, because that was all done with makeup brushes and we've got really nice smooth transitions, and I'll link that at the end. So feel free to check that out. That's on YouTube as well. That will give you a more in-depth idea of how this is done. But you can see I've already got a really, really smooth transition. The problem is for me, and so this is personal taste. The problem is for me, the darkest areas of this model are not dark enough. Remember, for the red to pop as much as I want it, I need to make the shadows darker. For the red to look really, really strong, I need to have much darker shadows. And the risk that we run is if we add black straight onto it, we can easily get a very muddy, dirty result. So you've got a couple of ways of doing this. Purple is a really good color to use for this. Green, it can be quite a good one, but when it comes to using the makeup brushes, it doesn't work so well. So what I would suggest is get a really nice dark purple, or in my case, I've added black. As you saw on the wet palette, I've added black to the red, so I get this really dark blacky red. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in those extreme areas where it changes angle. So in this case, whatever those ridges are that run down the jet bike canopy, areas that are facing underneath, I'm going to paint those hard lines where the underneath of those meet the flat of canopy. What this does is that separates those from the actual canopy itself, so it makes the jet bike really readable. We can clearly see the shape from far away, and remember, readability is a massive something that's really, really important when we're looking at armies, because most of the time armies we're looking at from far away. So once we've got those strong lines in, then with the side of our brush, very much like as if we were doing more traditional glazing, we're doing those sideward brushstroke motions into the darker areas. And all this is doing is it's going to keep tinting the red. Now the thing is because we've got black in this red, because this red is such a dark color now, because we've basically added the black to the Khorne Red, this starts covering very quickly. So what happens is it very quickly starts getting this very dark transition. Now the transition will be very rough. Again, we can come back and smooth that out later. So my paint consistency here is basically I'm thinning my paint down enough with water until it starts to become semi-transparent, so we can partially see through it, not all the way. And I know, like, I can give you a perfect mix. In this case, it was like 2 parts water to 1 part paint. But what you need to remember is every paint is different. So every paint is going to require a different consistency. It's going to require a different amount of water or a different amount of paint. So it's really important that you kind of judge this yourself, because if you're not using the same paints as me, then potentially that can cause you issues. So the idea with this is you want a semi-transparent paint layer. So when you put this on the model, you don't want that solid black red. You want that black red that's going to go over the red you've already got on the model, and it's going to be tinted by the red underneath. This allows you to build up like several layers, and it will give you the start of a nice smooth transition. Now, the next thing is the little ridges, even the top areas of the ridges, we need to make those pop a little bit more, because that red is still very flat. Now, you saw at the beginning I had these pink lines. Ignore the pink. It was a bit of an experiment on my part that I didn't use. I didn't like. So the paint that I'm using right now is Games Workshop Averland Sunset. So this is like an ochre color, like a mustardy color. So what I'm doing here is I'm now going to pick out my areas of this model that I want to really pop. Now I need to keep these small, because if they're too big, what's going to happen is I'm going to lose that saturated red. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm roughly, you can see like this is not smooth at all, I'm roughly painting in with the Averland Sunset these cone shapes which match the shape of those ridges on the front, on the top of the jet bike. And then I'm going over with white in those Averland Sunset areas. So I've got 2 gradients. So I've got the Averland Sunset, and then inside that I've got the white. Now, what I'm going to do first of all is over all of this, I'm going back with the Khador Red Base, the P3 Khador Red Base. So this is our main red color. I'm going to go over those colors that I've just done. What's going to happen eventually is it's going to go pure red again. But the reason for this is as we work this paint, generally speaking, what's going to happen is it's going to get less and less vibrant, because we're working with darker colors, we're building up those shadow colors. Majority of the time, we're going to lose some of that vibrancy from what we're doing. So this stage, which is why I was really rough with it, this stage is about bringing back the vibrancy of the red. And you can see, like, the more layers I put on this, the more red it's going to go, and the more that those marks are going to disappear. But you can see how much more vibrant that red is compared to that dark red that we've got everywhere else. And that's not because we've done anything wrong. It's just as we've been building up those transitions, some of the vibrancy nearly always gets lost. So we just want to bring that back. And then this gives us a good idea of what our red's going to look like. This part that I've done here, this is again entirely up to you. I wanted to put like a little highlight in between these ridges. I also wanted to frame the center ridge, so you can see that I put lines down either side of them. Now again, this is serving the same purpose as the previous highlights that I've done. What I'm going to end up doing after this is I'm going to go over it with that P3 Khador Red Base again, so our main red color. Again, this is about bringing back the vibrancy of the red. This is about making the red pop, because as we've been working over it, it gets darker and darker, and it doesn't look as nice. Now, with the reds, what you can see here, like that red did very little. That's because that red is too thin, so it's going to take me loads of coats of paint. So in this case, the red that I want to be going over this with is like 1 part water, 1 part paint. But again, that's for the P3 Khador Red Base. You might not be using that color. So the best way to be thinking about it again is you're going for a semi-transparent red. You want to put that red over the paint that you've got on the model, and you want it to be tinted by what's underneath. And in this case, all we're doing is we're going over it until it no longer looks pink, or it no longer looks like the Averland Sunset. You can see the difference there in the red that we've got. It's far more vibrant than where it was previously. And again, red is a really challenging color because it's so easy for it to go pink. And that's the last thing we want. What we're aiming for with this color scheme for Saim Han is we're looking to try and get as saturated a color. We want that red to get to this point of peak saturation where it's as bright, as vibrant as it possibly can be. And that's again why we're effectively pre-shading. So when people talk about pre-shading, and what they do is they get aerosol cans or an airbrush and they airbrush black from one side and then white from the other, and then they put a color over the top and it tints all of the colors, the tones of the colors. We're doing exactly the same thing here, but we're doing it with a paintbrush and we're doing it selectively. And that's it. You can see the difference and it's huge. So that is good enough. So if you wanted, it would be a perfectly good result to leave it at that, the Saim Hann Jetbike. So I can't stress this enough. That's a really nice red. It's done with a brush, and in fairness, this took me about 15 minutes to do that canopy on the red, and the canopy is the hardest part. The canopy is the hardest part to do with a paintbrush because it's such a large area. So if you've got 9 of these to do and that takes 15 minutes, actually that's really good timing. Even if it took you half an hour, that's still really good timing for a nice result. So the next steps are entirely down to you. So what you can do is you can add some glazes, which is what I'm doing here. So glazes are incredibly thin paints, consistency of paints, sorry. So in this part, this is like 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint. And I'm gradually building up over what I've done, and I'm smoothing out the transitions a little bit more. But it's up to you whether you do that or not. Remember, most people are not going to be looking that close. We already have a nice result. So it's up to you whether you go and do more glazes to smooth it out even more. It's up to you if you want to push the shadows even darker, which would be a really good thing to do. Like in hindsight, I wish I'd pushed my shadows all the way to black in certain places because that would have made it pop even more. Again, it's entirely your choice. And the last thing that I am going to do on this video, because it's the difficult part, is we're going to add in the highlights on the ridges. Now, this is where it gets really challenging, and it's up to you whether you want to do it. At the moment, I've just painted in the recesses. The next up, what we're going to do is P3 Khador Red, because that's our brightest pure red. We're going to start adding some Averland Sunset into it. So this starts giving it this slight skin tone. Starts turning it into like a skin tone, like this peachy color. So edge highlights, I mean, I can't stress this enough. You don't need edge highlights everywhere, but they are incredibly important. Again, these come back down to like readability. At the very least, put some edge highlights in. When you've got sharp shapes like this, they make a huge, huge difference. Make sure you do it. What it will do is it separates the shapes ultimately. And again, when we're looking at it from far away, it has a massive, massive impact. So you can see as well, I'm being a bit inventive here, to be honest with you. Like that edge highlight that I've just put in on either side of the ridge. Yeah, it might have a bit of a bright spot there, but it wouldn't really be that extreme. I quite like it, honestly, and that's why I did it. And that's good enough justification for me. So you don't necessarily need to do little edge highlights there. I really like them. Again, entirely down to you. It's also quite a challenging thing to do if you're less experienced. Painting a nice crisp line with the tip of your brush all the way down there can be incredibly difficult. So don't do it unless you're confident that you're going to be able to pull it off, because that sort of brush mark is the sort of brush mark where you might potentially get a little bit frustrated, and it might make you not want to progress any further with the model, let alone if you've got 8 more, if you're doing a unit of 9. So up to you. If you're not comfortable doing those lines, don't do them, because it might just end up like biting you. Again, edge highlight on whatever the flappy fin is in the center of the jetbike. I ain't got a clue what any of this stuff is, but it's a flappy thing. It can go up or down apparently. Edge highlights again. Now, if you look, I'm only doing the edges that are facing upwards. So I'm not doing every edge. I don't need to do every edge. Now, that's not to say that that's wrong. Remember, there is no wrong. It's only what you like. If you like edge highlighting every edge like GW does, then that's cool. There's nothing wrong with it. Go for it. For me, it's just a little bit too much, so I don't do it. But you can see all I've done is edges facing upwards. That gives me enough of an edge highlight to frame the shapes. Look at it from far away, we can clearly see what's going on. Now this is the hard bit. And I mean, I'm not gonna pretend like this is not a difficult paint job to do. Painting Eldar jet bikes or painting anything Eldar without an airbrush is incredibly challenging. So the whole thing is quite difficult, to be honest with you. But this is the really hard bit. What I'm aiming for here is along the center of these cone-shaped ridges or whatever they are, I'm gonna put a very, very small highlight. Now, the priority with this highlight is it needs to be tiny. Like, I can't stress this enough. If this highlight is too large, you're going to cover up too much of the previous red that you've used, and then it's just going to end up looking pink. All right, so less is more. Start small. For me, this highlight is incredibly important because it makes that jet bike incredibly striking. But again, you don't need to do it if you're not up for it. If you've got this far and you're not sure you're going to be able to do it and you're happy with what you've got, then just leave it as is. The priority is, though, is if you decide to go ahead, less is more. You want these to be really, really small. And remember, smaller they are, actually the shinier it's going to look. So go with what you like the look of. Now, the main thing that you can see, I'm using the same colors as I'm using for the edge highlight. So this is that red and Averland Sunset mix. So it's like a peachy color. And what I'm doing is, although it's looking like I'm using the tip of my brush, I'm using the side of my brush closer towards the tip because I'm doing very small brush strokes. Sorry, I will zoom back in a second. Because I'm doing very small brush strokes. So ultimately, I'm using the side of my brush. My brush strokes are always working towards the center of the highlight. So if the highlight is a cone shape and we're working from one side and going into the middle of that cone. So the end of my brush stroke each time is ending up in the middle of our highlight, because that way it's easier to hide where the end of our brush stroke is. Because remember, where we finish our brush stroke, generally, where we finish our brush stroke leaves the most paint. So it's easier to leave it in the middle of this little highlight cone because that's what color the highlight's going to be. Once you've done that, what you'll do is you'll start getting this transition. And it's fairly rough. Like you can see on screen at the moment, the transition is fairly rough. There's nothing wrong with it, but it could be smoother ultimately. So I don't know what just happened on screen there, by the way. I've got no idea what I was doing. But yeah, so what you need to remember is the more white you add to a paint, the more chalky it gets, and the more of a nightmare that it is to get these really smooth transitions. So you can see me going back to that red right now. This is really, really thin. So this red is thinned down to like 5 or 6 parts water, 1 part paint. So more of a glaze consistency, and I'm just smoothing out the transition. Because I've got a lot more, because I'm closer to white, it's much, much rougher. It's harder to get a nice smooth transition. And let's be perfectly honest, generally speaking, when you're painting nice, vibrant Eldar, you want smooth transitions, and that is incredibly difficult to do. It's one of the reasons why Eldar are so challenging to paint. This last stage here, this is where I've added white to the Averland Sunset, and all I'm doing with very thin paint again, so this is like 4 or 5 parts water. What I'm looking for with this is a really transparent paint. I want the paint to be like almost completely tinted by what's underneath it, so I can build it up very, very slowly. So in that highlight area that I've put in, that I've already previously put in, now I'm putting another highlight which is even smaller. Now the priority with this needs to be tiny, right? The reason why this pops and shines, because the highlight is so small. You look at this highlight, these brush strokes are like 1 or 2 millimeters. They're tiny, tiny strokes. If you go too large, I can't stress this enough, it's going to stop looking red and it's going to start looking pink. priority is the majority of this jet bike needs to be red. The highlights need to be incredibly small. All right. So most of the vibrancy of this paint job comes from the shadows being so dark. And then the actual pop itself comes from these very small highlights. And remember, you've got these highlights and they look too rough. Well, you've gone too bright. Really easy. Grab that red, thin it down. So you've got like that glaze consistency where it's really transparent, and just go over the whole of your highlight that you've actually painted. What that will do is it will smooth out the transition, and even it will darken down that transition that you've got. So don't panic if your transitions are looking really funky. You can go back over it with the red. Don't panic if you go too bright, because you can go back over it with the red. It's really simple to fix. It's very easy to fix. It's very difficult to get the transition right in the first place. So don't panic. Doing this highlight is incredibly challenging. Fixing your mistake when you do the highlight is not so challenging. But that's it. So that's how we do the canopy. Next up, what I want to do is get the black stripes on the jet bike. Now, I'm using Tamiya masking tape. I can't stress this enough. A good masking tape is so important. If you use rubbish masking tape, it's going to weep loads, so it's going to seep through absolute tons. Worse, it's probably going to tear your paint off of the model, and that is the last thing that you want. Now, what I would say is make sure that this is sealed properly. I haven't sealed this properly, so there's going to be a couple of little like seepages, but we'll fix that, so it's not a problem. But when it comes to this, you spent loads of time doing like a nice red canopy or any canopy. You don't want to have to like just fix a mistake at this stage because you've been lazy. Because ultimately that's what's happened with me, is I've been lazy. Now, the black on this is really like, it's there to break up the red. It's not important. You don't need to spend loads of time on it. You just need a simple black with some kind of highlight. Now remember, the key to painting black is not to paint black. Now what we mean by that is, when you look at something black in the real world, the majority of the time it's not actually pure black. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the highlight shape on the canopy, which means towards the center of the canopy we need to have it brighter, so we're going to introduce some grey. The problem is, if we introduce with pure grey, it's very boring, it's very dull. So what we can do is, by introducing a bluey grey or a greeny grey, it makes the black far more interesting and just a little bit different. So in this case, what we're going to be using is P3 coal black. You can see I've just painted it all towards the center. I've done exactly the same process as I did when I blended the red armor panel. That P3 coal black, I've thinned the paint down so it breaks the surface tension, so it's still quite wet. Remove the excess, and I'm almost just doing like a dry brush motion towards the center. And then that center line that runs all the way down, I've added a small amount of white to the P3 coal black, so that just makes it pop a little bit more. Now, the main thing is this part of the canopy, you don't actually want a huge amount of contrast in value. You don't need an extreme amount of contrast, because that part of the canopy is relatively flat and it needs to make sense with the red. So this is quite quick. The main thing we need to do is that center column cone thing, whatever it's called. I swear I'll learn the names next time. We want to make sure that that's consistent with what we did with the red. So you can see that I just painted those black lines on either side. And then what will happen is the shadows will be consistent with the shadows on the red. So that's the main thing there. You can see that the paint's it's seeped out a little bit onto the red. I mean, we can just fix that with a red paint. It's not a big deal. The benefit of painting this with a paintbrush instead of an airbrush is it's very easy to fix mistakes like that, because it's very easy to replicate what you've already done. Whereas if you used an airbrush, it's very hard to replicate the result that an airbrush has given you. So that's one of the benefits with this. But the truth is, learn from me. Like, don't be a lazy sod. Mask it up properly and you won't have this problem. Now, something to think about with this. If you've put those highlight lines on either side of that cone ridge thing, you've got those red highlight lines running on either side. Remember, this stuff needs to be consistent. So you now need to put a grey highlight line that runs on either side as well in the grey area. So that highlight line is consistent across the whole model. Because if you don't do it, it's just going to look really weird. So if you've done that on the red, make sure you do it on the black as well. And you can see, actually, the only place on these black lines which is black is as it curves round the outside of the canopy. The rest of it is grey. And the truth is like most of the time when we're painting black, we don't want a huge amount of black because, first of all, it looks very boring because we can't really see what's going on with it. And actually, in real life, the majority of the time when we're looking at black, what we're actually looking at is different shades of greys, ultimately. But you can see by using more of a bluey grey, so the P3 Cold Black is like this bluey grey, it's really, really nice. It just makes it a little bit more interesting. And it's also, the red is obviously like a really warm colour across the whole thing. By adding some more cold tones, blue is a cold colour, by adding more cold tones, it makes it pop a little bit more and makes it a lot more interesting. Right, so I've sped up the footage even more for the back of the jet bike. The process is exactly the same as what we did with the front of the canopy. The difference is it's smaller. All of the areas are smaller, sorry. So it's smaller surfaces. Now, with this, when I first started doing the canopy, I said to you that I was doing the Khorne Red and then I added black to it. I skipped that stage this time because I know that I just want to go dark straight away. So the shadow color that I'm painting in is Games Workshop Khorne Red with a little bit of black. The black that you put in is entirely up to you. I think this was Vallejo model color black, but GW Abaddon black will do exactly the same. Any black just to darken up the red. That's what we're going for. I've slapped that black-red mix into all of the areas that I want darker, and then I'm just smoothing it all out. So with this, I'm working much faster than I did with the canopy because I now know my process. I know what paints that I want to use. I know what I'm trying to achieve. So I can be a lot more messy. So you can see, like, all I'm doing at the moment is I'm working between those two colors, the black Khorne Red mix and the P3 Khador Red Base, and I'm just trying to get those transitions between those two colors. Again, if you wanted to, you could just leave it like this. It does look nice. For me, it's not really like striking enough. So that's why I go with the extra edge highlights and the bright highlight spots. The other thing to remember is if you wanted to, you could push these shadows to black. That would make the red pop even more, but you just need to make sure the majority of the model is red. The majority of the model needs to be that Khador Red base. And remember, our highlights need to be as small as possible. Now, the other thing is, what you want to think about with this is your bright areas. If you surround your bright red areas with dark shadow areas, it makes them pop even more. So think about that as well. Like, if you want certain parts of the jet bike to really stand out, surround them with dark areas. So this part of the seat, I just put a highlight in. By having all that dark red around it, it makes that part of the seat pop more, so it draws you into that area and less to the areas around it. Same as the end of the fin. As the fin comes out, you can see, like, towards the inside of the fin, like where it gets closer to the jet bike, I've put like a shadow color, and then towards the outside, we've got this highlight color. That means that actually the majority of people, when they look at this, they're going to look at the outside of the fin. So what you end up having is people look around outside the silhouette rather than looking at all the details, which means we can spend less time on the details. Same as, like, you can see the top of the jet bike where the gem is. All I've done is most of that area is quite dark, and I've put my highlight areas in place. And then again, that causes people to look at that area. People will look at the bright areas and ignore the dark areas. So it means if you want to, you can save time and you can almost cut corners by keeping areas of the model that you're not so interested in darker, and then you don't have to paint them as much. So with the process at the moment, you can see that I just placed down the Averland Sunset and then the Averland Sunset white mix. I'm going over it with the red again to give me that more vibrant red back. Now, I can't stress this enough. You don't want to do that stage. You don't have to. You're happy with the red that you've got. You don't have to do it. For me, it's about bringing back the vibrancy. But what I would say is if you decide to do it, You do it on one model, you have to do it on the other models. The fact is if you don't do it, you're not going to notice it. If you do it, you're not going to notice it. You only know that it's made a difference because we know that if you put a brighter color under red, it makes it more vibrant. It gives it a nicer color. But if you do it on one model, and then let's say, for example, you get halfway through a unit of 9 jet bikes, and then the last 4 of those jet bikes, you think, you know what, it's just such a pointless stage. And then you don't do it. You will have 2 different colored jet bikes. You will have half your unit one color jet bike, and the other half of your unit a different color. I can't stress this enough. If you decide to do it, you're in all the way. You need to do it on every model. Otherwise, you will have models that look different reds. It's one of those things that it's very hard to see the difference until you've got 2 models. One which has it and one which doesn't have it. So if you do it on everything. Next stage up, nice and simple, edge highlights. Now in this case, remember the majority of my edge highlights are any edges that are facing upwards, but you can see the outside of the fin there that I've just edge highlighted. That is actually facing downwards. That's not facing like upwards, but I chose to do it because I wanted the outside edge of that fin to be framed really well because it's a bright area of the fin. I want people looking there rather than parts of the model that I haven't really done much with. So when I paint the black, for example, on this jet bike, all I end up doing is I paint the engine and that sort of stuff black, and then I just put some grey edge highlights on it. So it's not really painted in a very advanced way at all. It's very basic, and actually I've been quite messy with it. But because none of those areas around the black engine or the black engine itself is very bright, no one's really looking there. What they're looking at is they're looking at the canopy, they're looking at the red of the gem area on top, or they're looking around the seat, or they're looking towards the outside of the fins. So by edge highlighting on the outside of the fin and breaking that kind of rule that I was using of only having the upwards facing edges highlighted, it draws the viewer's attention away from those areas that are maybe a little bit more on the dodgy side of the paint job. And we've talked about this on previous videos. Remember, it's always beneficial to guide your viewer where you want them to look. And in this case, all I want anyone to look at is the red of the jet bike. I don't care about the details. Most people are not going to look at them. And when we paint the rider, actually what most people are going to look at is the white of the helmet, and then they'll look around at the jet bike. But we can easily get away with making the most striking area, the most prominent areas look good, and then the detailed areas, like, no one's really going to notice. So we can save loads of time on those from an army painting perspective. You don't have to. I mean, if you want, you can spend as much time on every part of the model as you want, and that's great if you do, but not everyone has that luxury. So this is why when you see so many like airbrushed, extreme high contrast airbrushed armies, they look very striking, because actually what we have is you have one area that's painted with such extreme value, but then when you look up close, if you actually make a point of looking up close, the majority of them are not actually so well finished. And no one really cares, because most of the time you just don't notice it, because what you're looking at is the nice shiny armor and that sort of stuff. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, as I said, if you want to spend loads of time blending the engines and that sort of stuff, by all means do it. But it just depends on how much time you want to invest in it. Because that's all this is, remember. You can have a really nicely painted army where you don't have to invest a huge amount of time, because that's all this comes down to. Not everyone has 50 hours to spend on every single model, and unfortunately if you've got an airbrush, brush painting can be very slow. So you want to cut corners if you can, and that's it. So you can see the jet bike is basically all done. What I'm going to do is add the last of the edge highlights, have a little bit of a clean up on some of the blends, and then push some bright spots. So what you'll see is on the jet bike in the end, I decided to add some very small white little marks. And this is just at those brightest areas to make it pop, which I quite liked. And that's it. That's pretty much how we did it. So this is the jet bike finished on screen. The next video will go over the rider. I mean, the gems, I'm going to do a separate video on how to paint gems properly anyway. These particular ones I've just painted green, but we'll do a video in future. So as always, I hope it's been helpful. Questions, queries, leave them in the comments below. If you guys do want to support, as always, feel free to check out the Patreon for additional, far more in-depth video content, or even options for one-to-one tuition, because I do teach full-time now. But thanks very much, and I'll catch you later.